Welcome to Woo English, where we teach English through fascinating stories from history. In today's video, we'll dive into the life of George Washington, the father of his country and the first president of the United States. You'll discover his journey from a young boy in Virginia to a leader who helped shape a new nation. We'll explore his incredible contributions to the American Revolution, his role in the founding of the United States, and the principles of leadership and integrity that made him a true hero. Our goal is to help you improve your English while enjoying these inspiring stories. If you enjoy the video, don't forget to share it, like it, leave a comment, and subscribe for more engaging content. Let's get started. Welcome to Woo English, where we teach English through fascinating stories from history. In today's video, we'll dive into the life of George Washington, the father of his country, and the first president of the United States. You'll discover his journey from a young boy in Virginia to a leader who helped shape a new nation. We'll explore his incredible contributions to the American Revolution, his role in the founding of the United States, and the principles of leadership and integrity that made him a true hero. Our goal is to help you improve your English while enjoying these inspiring stories. If you enjoy the video, don't forget to share it, like it, leave a comment, and subscribe for more engaging content. Let's get started. Chapter 1. The Early Days. George Washington was born on February 22, 1732, in a small, simple farmhouse in the quiet countryside of Virginia. The world he entered was a vast and untamed land, full of opportunity, but also full of challenges. The Washington family was not wealthy, but they were respected. George's father, Augustine Washington, was a hard-working man who owned land and worked to provide for his growing family. George was the eldest of 6 children, and from an early age he felt the weight of responsibility on his young shoulders. George Washington was born on February 22, 1732, in a small, simple farmhouse in the quiet countryside of Virginia. The world he entered was a vast and untamed land, full of opportunity, but also full of challenges. The Washington family was not wealthy, but they were respected. George's father, Augustine Washington, was a hard-working man who owned land and worked to provide for his growing family. George was the eldest of 6 children, and from an early age, he felt the weight of responsibility on his young shoulders. As a child, George was curious, always asking questions, always wanting to understand the world around him. He spent his days exploring the fields and forests near his home, learning about the plants and animals that lived there. He loved the outdoors, the freedom of running through the open fields, the thrill of discovering something new. This connection to the land would stay with him throughout his life, shaping the way he saw the world and his place in it. As a child, George was curious, always asking questions, always wanting to understand the world around him. He spent his days exploring the fields and forests near his home, learning about the plants and animals that lived there. He loved the outdoors, the freedom of running through the open fields, the thrill of discovering something new. This connection to the land would stay with him throughout his life, shaping the way he saw the world and his place in it. But life was not always easy for young George. When he was just 11 years old, tragedy struck. His father died suddenly, leaving the family in a difficult situation. George, as the oldest son, had to grow up quickly. He had to help his mother, Mary Ball Washington, take care of his younger siblings and manage the household. It was a heavy burden for a boy so young, but George faced it with the determination and strength that would come to define him. But life was not always easy for young George. When he was just 11 years old, tragedy struck. His father died suddenly, leaving the family in a difficult situation. George, as the oldest son, had to grow up quickly. He had to help his mother, Mary Ball Washington, take care of his younger siblings and manage the household. It was a heavy burden for a boy so young, but George faced it with the determination and strength that would come to define him. Without his father to guide him, George looked to other men in his life for advice and support. His older half-brother, Lawrence Washington, became a mentor to him. Lawrence had served in the British Navy and was a man of the world, experienced, knowledgeable, and wise. He saw potential in George and took him under his wing, teaching him about leadership, responsibility, and honor. Lawrence's influence on George was profound. He helped to shape the young boy into the man who would one day lead a nation. Without his father to guide him, George looked to other men in his life for advice and support. His older half-brother, Lawrence Washington, became a mentor to him. Lawrence had served in the British Navy and was a man of the world, experienced, knowledgeable, and wise. He saw potential in George and took him under his wing, teaching him about leadership, responsibility, and honor. Lawrence's influence on George was profound. He helped to shape the young boy into the man who would one day lead a nation. George's education was also an important part of his upbringing. Although he did not attend a formal school for long, he was taught at home by private tutors. He learned the basics, reading, writing, and arithmetic. But more importantly, he learned about character, about the importance of honesty, hard work, and integrity. These were the values that George Washington would carry with him throughout his life. Values that would guide him in every decision he made. George's education was also an important part of his upbringing. Although he did not attend a formal school for long, he was taught at home by private tutors. He learned the basics, reading, writing, and arithmetic. But more importantly, he learned about character, about the importance of honesty, hard work, and integrity. These were the values that George Washington would carry with him throughout his life. Values that would guide him in every decision he made. As he grew older, George became fascinated by the land around him. He wanted to understand it, to explore it, to map it out. At the age of 16, he began working as a surveyor, a job that took him deep into the wilderness of Virginia. It was a tough job. The days were long, the work was hard, and the dangers were real. But George loved it. He loved the challenge, the adventure, the opportunity to learn and grow. As he grew older, George became fascinated by the land around him. He wanted to understand it, to explore it, to map it out. At the age of 16, he began working as a surveyor, a job that took him deep into the wilderness of Virginia. It was a tough job. The days were long, the work was hard, and the dangers were real. But George loved it. He loved the challenge, the adventure, the opportunity to learn and grow. Surveying was more than just a job for George. It was a calling. It allowed him to see parts of the country that few people had ever seen. He traveled through thick forests, across wide rivers, and over rugged mountains. He learned how to navigate by the stars, how to find his way in the wilderness, and how to survive in the toughest conditions. These were skills that would later serve him well. Skills that would help him lead an army through some of the most difficult battles in American history. Surveying was more than just a job for George. It was a calling. It allowed him to see parts of the country that few people had ever seen. He traveled through thick forests, across wide rivers, and over rugged mountains. He learned how to navigate by the stars, how to find his way in the wilderness, and how to survive in the toughest conditions. These were skills that would later serve him well. Skills that would help him lead an army through some of the most difficult battles in American history. But surveying was not just about adventure. It was also about responsibility. As a surveyor, George had to be precise, accurate, and reliable. People depended on him to measure their land correctly, to mark their boundaries fairly, and to keep careful records of his work. This responsibility taught him the importance of attention to detail, of doing a job well, of being trustworthy. These were lessons that George took to heart. Lessons that would become the foundation of his leadership. But surveying was not just about adventure. It was also about responsibility. As a surveyor, George had to be precise, accurate, and reliable. People depended on him to measure their land correctly, to mark their boundaries fairly, and to keep careful records of his work. This responsibility taught him the importance of attention to detail, of doing a job well, of being trustworthy. These were lessons that George took to heart, lessons that would become the foundation of his leadership. Through his work as a surveyor, George Washington began to earn a reputation as a young man of promise. He was known for his strong character, his determination, and his ability to get the job done. People began to take notice of him, to see him as someone who could be relied upon, someone who could be trusted. Through his work as a surveyor, George Washington began to earn a reputation as a young man of promise. He was known for his strong character, his determination, and his ability to get the job done. People began to take notice of him, to see him as someone who could be relied upon, someone who could be trusted. But George was not content to stay in one place. He was ambitious, driven by a desire to make something of himself, to rise above the circumstances of his birth. He wanted more than just a quiet life as a farmer or surveyor. He wanted to make a difference, to play a part in something bigger than himself. And so, he began to seek out opportunities that would allow him to grow, to learn, to prove himself. But George was not content to stay in one place. He was ambitious, driven by a desire to make something of himself, to rise above the circumstances of his birth. He wanted more than just a quiet life as a farmer or surveyor. He wanted to make a difference, to play a part in something bigger than himself. And so he began to seek out opportunities that would allow him to grow, to learn, to prove himself. One such opportunity came when he was just 21 years old. The governor of Virginia asked George to undertake a dangerous mission. A mission that would take him deep into the wilderness, into the heart of French-controlled territory. The goal was to deliver a message to the French, warning them to leave the land that the British claimed as their own. It was a mission fraught with danger, a mission that could have ended in disaster. But George Washington accepted it without hesitation. He saw it as a chance to prove himself, to show what he was capable of. One such opportunity came when he was just 21 years old. The governor of Virginia asked George to undertake a dangerous mission. A mission that would take him deep into the wilderness, into the heart of French-controlled territory. The goal was to deliver a message to the French, warning them to leave the land that the British claimed as their own. It was a mission fraught with danger, a mission that could have ended in disaster. But George Washington accepted it without hesitation. He saw it as a chance to prove himself, to show what he was capable of. The journey was long and difficult. George and his small group of men had to navigate through icy rivers, over snow-covered mountains, and through thick, dark forests. The weather was harsh, the conditions brutal, but George pressed on, showing a level of courage and determination that belied his young age. He faced every challenge head-on, refusing to give up, refusing to back down. The journey was long and difficult. George and his small group of men had to navigate through icy rivers, over snow-covered mountains, and through thick, dark forests. The weather was harsh, the conditions brutal. But George pressed on, showing a level of courage and determination that belied his young age. He faced every challenge head-on, refusing to give up, refusing to back down. This mission was the beginning of George Washington's journey, a journey that would take him from the quiet fields of Virginia to the battlefields of the American Revolution, from a young boy with big dreams to the leader of a new nation. But even as he faced the challenges of the wilderness, even as he took his first steps into the world of leadership, George Washington remained true to the values that had been instilled in him as a child. He remained honest, hardworking, and committed to doing what was right. This mission was the beginning of George Washington's journey, a journey that would take him from the quiet fields of Virginia to the battlefields of the American Revolution, from a young boy with big dreams to the leader of a new nation. But even as he faced the challenges of the wilderness, even as he took his first steps into the world of leadership, George Washington remained true to the values that had been instilled in him as a child. He remained honest, hardworking, and committed to doing what was right. Chapter 2. The Soldier's Path. Chapter 2. The Soldier's Path. George Washington was just 21 years old, a young man with big dreams and a strong sense of duty. The year was 1753, and the world around him was changing quickly. The British and the French were competing for control of North America, and tensions were rising. The vast, unexplored land was rich in resources, and both empires wanted to claim it as their own. It was a dangerous time, a time when decisions could change the course of history. George Washington was just 21 years old, a young man with big dreams and a strong sense of duty. The year was 1753, and the world around him was changing quickly. The British and the French were competing for control of North America, and tensions were rising. The vast, unexplored land was rich in resources, and both empires wanted to claim it as their own. It was a dangerous time, a time when decisions could change the course of history. In the colony of Virginia, George had already made a name for himself. He was known as a skilled surveyor and a man of integrity. People respected him for his honesty, his hard work, and his ability to handle difficult tasks. But George was not content to simply live a quiet life as a surveyor. He wanted to serve his country, to protect his home and his people. And so, when an opportunity came to join the Virginia militia, he did not hesitate. At just 21, George Washington was asked to become a major in the Virginia militia. It was a great honor and a great responsibility. The governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, had a mission for George, a mission that was both critical and dangerous. The French had built a series of forts in the Ohio Valley, a region that both the British and the French claimed as their own. Governor Dinwiddie needed someone to deliver a message to the French, a message that demanded they leave the land immediately. It was a bold move, and one that could lead to war. George knew the risks, but he accepted the mission without hesitation. The journey ahead was long and treacherous. George and his small group of men had to travel over 500 miles through the wilderness, in the middle of winter. The cold was bitter, the snow deep, and the rivers icy. They faced constant danger, from the freezing temperatures, from wild animals, and from the possibility of being attacked by hostile forces. But George was determined. He knew that the success of this mission was vital, and he would not let anything stand in his way. As they traveled deeper into the wilderness, the challenges grew greater. The thick forests seemed to close in around them, the trees towering like giants in the snow. The nights were long and cold, the wind howling through the trees like a wild beast. But George did not falter. He led his men with confidence and courage, showing the first signs of the leadership that would define his life. Finally, after weeks of grueling travel, George and his men reached Fort Le Boeuf, the French outpost where they were to deliver the message. The French officers received them with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. George, standing tall and composed, handed over the letter from Governor Dinwiddie. The message was clear. The French were to leave the Ohio Valley immediately or face the consequences. The French commander, however, was not easily swayed. He refused to leave and sent George back with a letter of his own, stating that the French had no intention of abandoning their claim to the land. The return journey was just as perilous as the way there, perhaps even more so. The weather worsened, the cold biting at their skin like sharp teeth. At one point, George and a companion, Christopher Gist, found themselves separated from the rest of the group. They had to cross the Allegheny River, which was partially frozen and treacherous. Using a makeshift raft, they attempted to cross, but disaster struck. The raft capsized, throwing them into the icy water. George narrowly escaped drowning, pulling himself onto the ice with freezing hands. They spent the night on a small island in the middle of the river, exposed to the brutal cold, but somehow they survived. When George finally returned to Virginia, he delivered the French response to Governor Dinwiddie. The mission had not gone as planned. The French had refused to leave, and war seemed inevitable. But George had proven himself. He had faced incredible dangers and had not backed down. His courage, determination, and leadership had shone through, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The mission to Fort Le Boeuf marked the beginning of George Washington's military career. It was a trial by fire, a test of his character and his resolve. And though the mission had not achieved its goal, it had shown everyone that George Washington was a man to be reckoned with. His bravery did not go unnoticed. People began to see him as more than just a young man with potential. They saw him as a leader, someone who could be trusted in times of crisis. The events of that winter in the wilderness also sparked a much larger conflict, the French and Indian War. The struggle between the British and the French for control of North America would rage on for years, pulling George Washington deeper into the world of military service. He would face many more battles, many more challenges, and each one would shape him, mold him into the leader that history would remember. As a soldier, George learned the harsh realities of war. He saw the suffering, the loss, and the chaos that came with it. But he also learned about strategy, about leadership, and about the importance of perseverance. These were lessons that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Lessons that would prepare him for the even greater challenges that lay ahead. But in those early days, George Washington was still just a young man, learning, growing, and finding his way in a world full of uncertainty. He did not know what the future would hold, but he knew one thing for sure. He was ready to face whatever came his way. He had taken his first steps on the path of a soldier, a path that would lead him to places he had never imagined, to heights he could not yet see. And so, George Washington's journey as a soldier began, with a single mission, in the depths of winter, through the wild and untamed wilderness of Virginia. It was the start of a story that would unfold over many years, a story of courage, determination, and leadership, a story that would shape the future of a nation. The young man who set out on that cold winter day had no idea that he was beginning a journey that would change the course of history. But with each step, with each challenge he faced, he moved closer to his destiny, the destiny of becoming one of the greatest leaders the world has ever known. Chapter 3. The Call to Lead. The year was 1774, a time of growing unrest in the American colonies. For years, the colonists had lived under British rule, but now something was changing. The British government had started to impose heavy taxes on the colonies, demanding more and more money from the people. These taxes were supposed to pay for the costs of the British Empire. But the colonists were not happy. They had no say in the decisions that affected their lives, no voice in the British Parliament. It was a time of frustration, of anger, and of a growing desire for change. Among the colonists, a man named George Washington was becoming well known. George was a respected landowner and soldier in Virginia. He had served his colony faithfully in the French and Indian War, and his reputation for honesty and leadership was unmatched. People looked up to him. They trusted him. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. His calm and steady presence was like a rock in the stormy seas of the times. As tensions between the colonies and Britain grew, leaders from across the colonies began to gather. They knew that something had to be done, that they could not continue living under British rule without representation. In September 1774, They came together in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. It was a meeting of minds and hearts, a gathering of those who were willing to stand up for their rights. George Washington was among them. He had been chosen as a delegate from Virginia, a position of great honor and responsibility. He was not the type to seek out power, but he understood the importance of the moment. This was a time to act, a time to stand with his fellow colonists in the face of growing tyranny. In the halls of the Continental Congress, there was much debate. Some wanted to try to find a peaceful solution with Britain, to ask the king to listen to their grievances. Others believed that the time for talk was over, that the only way to secure their freedom was to fight for it. George listened carefully to both sides. He weighed the arguments, considered the risks, and thought deeply about what was best for the colonies. But even as they debated, events were moving quickly. The British were not interested in compromise. They continued to impose their will on the colonies, and the tension grew with each passing day. It was becoming clear that war might be the only option, a war that would change everything. By the spring of 1775, the situation had reached a breaking point. In April, British troops marched on the towns of Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts, leading to the first shots being fired in what would become the American Revolution. The news spread like wildfire, and the colonies were electrified. The time for action had come. Just a few months later, in June 1775, the Continental Congress made a fateful decision. They needed someone to lead their army, someone who could inspire the men, someone who could stand up to the powerful British forces. The choice was unanimous. George Washington was named the Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. The responsibility was enormous. The army was untrained, poorly equipped, and facing the might of the British Empire. But George did not hesitate. He accepted the command with humility, knowing the challenges that lay ahead. He knew that the fight for freedom would be long and difficult, but he also knew that it was a fight worth having. A fight that could change the world. As George rode north to take command of the army in Boston, he must have felt the weight of history on his shoulders. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with dangers and unknowns. But he was ready. His entire life had prepared him for this moment. The lessons he had learned as a young man, the importance of honesty, integrity, and perseverance, would guide him now. He was not just fighting for himself or for Virginia. He was fighting for the future of all the colonies, for the right to live in a land where people could be free. When George arrived in Boston, he found an army that was eager but inexperienced. The men were brave, but they lacked discipline. They had come from different colonies, with different backgrounds and beliefs. It was George's task to unite them, to turn this ragtag group into a force that could stand up to the British. And so, George Washington began the work that would define his life. He trained the men, taught them how to fight as one, and inspired them with his own courage. He knew that the road to victory would be long, that there would be many defeats and hardships along the way. But he also knew that the cause was just, that the fight for freedom was a fight worth having. As the war dragged on, there were times when all seemed lost. The British forces were strong, their resources vast, but George Washington never gave up. He led his men through bitter winters, through battles where hope seemed far away. His leadership, his determination, and his belief in the cause of freedom became a beacon of hope for the entire nation. Under his command, the Continental Army began to find its footing. They won battles, they learned from their mistakes, and they grew stronger. The dream of independence, once just a distant hope, began to feel like something real, something within reach. But the war was far from over. The fight for freedom would continue for many years, testing George Washington and his men in ways they could not yet imagine. But no matter how hard the road became, George stood firm. He had answered the call to lead, and he would see it through to the end. In the face of overwhelming odds, George Washington remained steadfast. He was not just a soldier, he was a leader, a symbol of the courage and determination of a people who would not be silenced. The fight for freedom had begun, and George Washington was at the center of it all, guiding the colonies on the path to independence, on the path to becoming a new nation. Chapter 4. The Revolution Begins. The year was 1775, a year that would change the course of history. The American colonies were growing restless under British rule. Taxes were high, and the colonists felt their voices were not being heard. They wanted freedom. They wanted to govern themselves. But the British, with their powerful army, were determined to keep control. Tensions were rising, and war seemed inevitable. On April 19, 1775, the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. The American Revolution had begun. It was a struggle like no other. The British Army was the strongest in the world, well-trained, well-equipped, and experienced in battle. The American forces were not. They were farmers, tradesmen, and ordinary people who had never fought in a war. They had little money, few weapons, and no experience. But they had something stronger than weapons. They had the will to be free. As the fighting spread, the Continental Congress knew they needed a leader to unite the colonies and lead the army. They turned to a man who had already proven himself in battle, a man with courage, determination, and a deep love for his country. That man was George Washington. On June 15, 1775, George Washington was appointed as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. He accepted the role with humility, knowing the challenges that lay ahead. He knew that leading this army would not be easy, that the road to victory would be long and hard. But Washington was ready. He believed in the cause, and he believed in the men who would fight beside him. Washington's first task was to take command of the troops surrounding Boston, where the British were heavily fortified. The American forces were poorly organized and supplies were scarce. But Washington worked tirelessly to bring order to the chaos. He trained the men, strengthened their defenses, and inspired them with his own unwavering resolve. He knew that they were fighting not just for themselves, but for the future of their country. The early days of the Revolution were filled with uncertainty. The British had the advantage in almost every way. They had more soldiers, more weapons, and more experience. The Americans had little more than hope and determination, but they were fighting for something they believed in deeply, the right to govern themselves, to live in freedom, to create a new nation where all men were equal. The British underestimated the resolve of the American people. They believed that the rebellion would be crushed quickly, that the colonists would soon give up. But they were wrong. The Americans were willing to fight for their freedom, to sacrifice everything for the chance to build a better future. One of the first major battles of the Revolution was the Battle of Bunker Hill, fought on June 17, 1775. The British won the battle, but at a great cost. They suffered heavy losses, and the Americans showed that they could stand up to the might of the British Army. It was a small victory for the Americans, but it gave them hope. Hope that they could win this war, that they could achieve their dream of independence. As the war dragged on, Washington faced many challenges. The army was often short on supplies, and the men were hungry, cold, and tired. Many wanted to give up, to return to their homes and their families. But Washington never wavered. He knew that they were fighting for something greater than themselves, and he inspired his men to keep going, to keep fighting, even when all seemed lost. The winter of 1777 to 1778 was one of the darkest times of the Revolution. Washington and his men were camped at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. The conditions were terrible. The soldiers were cold, hungry, and sick. Many had no shoes, their feet leaving bloody footprints in the snow. But Washington stayed with his men. He shared their hardships, encouraged them, and reminded them of why they were fighting. His presence gave them strength, and they endured. The American Revolution was a test of endurance, of courage, of the will to be free. It was a struggle that would take years to win, a struggle that would demand everything from those who fought in it. But through it all, George Washington remained steadfast. He led his men with honor, with integrity, and with an unshakable belief in the cause of liberty. The tide of the war began to turn in favor of the Americans. The French, inspired by the American fight for freedom, joined the war as allies in 1778. Their support brought much-needed supplies, troops, and naval power. Washington's strategy, combined with the determination of his soldiers and the support of the French, began to weaken the British hold on the colonies. In 1781, after 6 long years of war, the British Army, led by General Cornwallis, was trapped at Yorktown, Virginia. With the help of the French, Washington launched a final assault. The battle was fierce, the outcome uncertain. But when the dust settled, the British surrendered. The war was over. America had won its freedom. And George Washington, the man who had led them through it all, became a hero. The American Revolution was more than just a war. It was the birth of a nation founded on the principles of freedom, equality, and democracy. A nation where the people had the power to govern themselves, to choose their leaders, and to live in liberty. George Washington's leadership during the Revolution was crucial to the success of the American cause. His courage, his determination, and his unwavering belief in the principles of freedom and justice inspired a nation. He showed that true leadership is not about power or glory. It is about service, about putting the needs of the country before your own. As the new nation began to take shape, the people looked to Washington to lead them once again. They trusted him, they respected him, and they knew that he was the right person to guide them through the challenges that lay ahead. The American Revolution was just the beginning of George Washington's journey. His legacy would continue to grow as he took on the role of the first President of the United States, setting the standards for leadership and governance that would guide the nation for centuries to come. Remember, you're listening to Woo English, where we make learning English both fun and educational with stories that matter. If you're enjoying the journey through George Washington's life, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and leave a comment below. Your feedback helps us create even more engaging content. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe for more stories like this one. Now, let's dive into Chapter 5. Remember, you're listening to Woo English, where we make learning English both fun and educational with stories that matter. If you're enjoying the journey through George Washington's life, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and leave a comment below. Your feedback helps us create even more engaging content. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe for more stories like this one. Now let's dive into Chapter 5. Chapter 5. The Winter at Valley Forge. The winter of 1777 to 1778. It was one of the darkest and most difficult times of the American Revolution. The Continental Army, led by General George Washington, was struggling. The war had been going on for over 2 years, and the soldiers were tired, hungry, and cold. They had fought bravely against the British, but now, as the harsh winter set in, their spirits were beginning to break. The winter of 1777 to 1778. It was one of the darkest and most difficult times of the American Revolution. The Continental Army, led by General George Washington, was struggling. The war had been going on for over 2 years, and the soldiers were tired, hungry, and cold. They had fought bravely against the British, but now, as the harsh winter set in, their spirits were beginning to break. Valley Forge, The name itself would come to symbolize the hardships and the determination of the American cause. It was here, in this desolate place, that George Washington and his army would face their greatest challenge. They were not fighting a battle against the British. They were fighting a battle against the elements, against hunger, against despair. The soldiers arrived at Valley Forge in December 1777. The snow was already deep, and the cold was biting. The men had little food, and even less clothing. Many of them were barefoot, their feet wrapped in rags to protect them from the freezing ground. As they marched into camp, they left behind them a trail of bloody footprints in the snow, a stark reminder of their suffering. The soldiers arrived at Valley Forge in December 1777. The snow was already deep, and the cold was biting. The men had little food, and even less clothing. Many of them were barefoot, their feet wrapped in rags to protect them from the freezing ground. As they marched into camp, they left behind them a trail of bloody footprints in the snow, a stark reminder of their suffering. The camp at Valley Forge was not much more than a collection of rough huts, hastily built shelters that offered little protection from the cold. Inside, the soldiers huddled together for warmth, but there was no escape from the chill that seeped into their bones. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, and the smoke from their small fires filled the air, stinging their eyes and throats. The conditions were miserable, and the men were exhausted. But George Washington, he did not abandon his men. He did not retreat to a warm house or a comfortable bed. No, he stayed with them, shared their hardships, their hunger, and their suffering. He walked among them, offering words of encouragement, reminding them of the cause they were fighting for. His presence alone was a source of strength for the weary soldiers. They knew that if their general could endure these hardships, then they could too. Every day, George Washington faced difficult decisions. Supplies were scarce. Food, clothing, and medicine were in short supply. The men were sick, many of them suffering from diseases like smallpox and typhoid. Washington knew that without proper care, his army could be destroyed not by the British, but by the winter itself. He wrote letters to Congress, pleading for more supplies, more help. But the response was slow, and the situation grew more desperate with each passing day. Yet, even in these darkest moments, Washington's leadership shined the brightest. He knew that this winter could break his army, or it could make them stronger. He decided to take action, to turn this ragged group of men into a disciplined, united force that could stand up to the British when the spring came. One of the first things Washington did was to bring in foreign officers to help train his troops. Among them was a man named Baron von Steuben, a Prussian military officer with a wealth of experience. Von Steuben did not speak much English, but his passion and expertise were clear. He drilled the soldiers day after day, teaching them how to march, how to fight, how to work together as a unit. The training was tough, the conditions brutal. But slowly, the men began to improve. They learned to move as one, to trust each other, and to trust in their leaders. Washington also worked to improve the morale of his men. He knew that they needed more than just food and training. They needed hope. He encouraged them to think of their families, to remember why they were fighting. He reminded them that they were not just fighting for themselves, but for the future of their country, for the freedom that they all believed in. His words were simple, but they were filled with the conviction that only a true leader can inspire. Throughout that long, cold winter, George Washington continued to lead by example. He spent his days working tirelessly for his men, and his nights writing letters, planning strategies, and thinking about the future. He was determined that when spring came, his army would be ready. Ready to face the British, ready to fight for their freedom, ready to win. The winter at Valley Forge was harsh. The conditions were brutal. But it was also a time of transformation. Under Washington's leadership, the Continental Army became stronger, more disciplined, more united. They were no longer just a group of farmers and tradesmen with muskets. They were soldiers. And as the snow began to melt and the first signs of spring appeared, they were ready to take the fight to the British once more. The experience at Valley Forge forged not just an army, but a nation. The men who survived that winter emerged with a new sense of purpose, a new determination to see the war through to the end. They had suffered greatly, but they had also grown stronger, more resilient. And they knew that they had done so under the leadership of George Washington, a man who had stood with them through the darkest days, who had never given up on them or the cause they were fighting for. As the army marched out of Valley Forge in June 1778, they did so with a renewed sense of hope. They were not just marching to battle, they were marching towards a future they believed in, a future that George Washington had helped them see. The winter at Valley Forge had tested them in every way, but it had also prepared them for the challenges ahead. George Washington's leadership during that winter was a turning point in the American Revolution. It was a time when he showed not just his military skill, but his deep commitment to his men and to the cause of freedom. He had taken a struggling, broken army and turned it into a force that could stand up to the British Empire. And in doing so, he had shown the world what it truly meant to be a leader. George Washington's leadership during that winter was a turning point in the American Revolution. It was a time when he showed not just his military skill, but his deep commitment to his men and to the cause of freedom. He had taken a struggling, broken army and turned it into a force that could stand up to the British Empire. And in doing so, he had shown the world what it truly meant to be a leader. Chapter 6. The Tide Turns. The year was 1781. The American Revolution had been raging for 6 long years. 6 years of battles, of hardships, of hope that sometimes seemed to flicker like a candle in the wind. The fight for independence had tested the will of every soldier, every citizen. And at the heart of it all, leading them through the storm, was George Washington. George Washington had seen it all. He had witnessed the fear in his soldiers' eyes, had felt the sting of defeat, and had carried the weight of a nation's hopes on his shoulders. But through every trial, he had remained steadfast, unshaken in his belief that freedom was worth fighting for. George Washington had seen it all. He had witnessed the fear in his soldiers' eyes, had felt the sting of defeat, and had carried the weight of a nation's hopes on his shoulders. But through every trial, he had remained steadfast, unshaken in his belief that freedom was worth fighting for. By 1781, the situation was critical. The British, under General Cornwallis, were determined to crush the American spirit once and for all. The British Army was strong, well-equipped, and confident. They believed that victory was within their grasp, that it was only a matter of time before the American forces would crumble. But George Washington had other plans. He knew that the time had come to strike a decisive blow, one that would turn the tide of the war in favor of the Americans. And he knew that he could not do it alone. The French, who had become allies of the American cause, had sent troops and ships to help. It was a crucial partnership, one that could change the course of history. Washington and his French ally, General Rochambeau, devised a bold plan. They would march their combined forces south, toward Virginia, where Cornwallis had set up his base in the town of Yorktown. The British, thinking they were safe, had fortified their position, but Washington saw an opportunity. He would trap them there, surround them by land and sea, and force them to surrender. The march to Yorktown was long and grueling. The soldiers, many of whom had already endured so much, pushed forward with determination. They knew that this could be their chance, their moment to end the war and secure their freedom. George Washington rode at the front, his presence inspiring his men to keep going, to push through their fatigue and their doubts. As they approached Yorktown, the tension grew. The British had no idea that the entire American and French armies were closing in on them. Washington's plan relied on secrecy and speed, and everything was falling into place. The French fleet, led by Admiral de Grasse, blocked the Chesapeake Bay, cutting off any hope of British escape by sea. The trap was set. The battle began on September 28, 1781. For days, the American and French forces bombarded the British positions. The air was thick with smoke. The sound of cannon fire echoed across the battlefield, and the ground shook with the force of the explosions. The British fought back fiercely, but they were outnumbered and surrounded. Washington watched as his plan unfolded, knowing that everything was on the line. The fighting was intense, brutal. The American and French soldiers advanced, digging trenches, building fortifications, and closing in on the British with every passing day. George Washington was in the thick of it, directing the battle with a calm authority that inspired everyone around him. He knew that victory was within reach, but he also knew that it could slip away if they made even the slightest mistake. Finally, on October 14th, Washington ordered a daring nighttime assault on the British defenses. Led by Alexander Hamilton, the Americans stormed the British redoubts, capturing them after fierce hand-to-hand combat. The British lines were breached, and their position became untenable. The noose was tightening, and Cornwallis knew it. On October 17th, a white flag appeared above the British lines. Cornwallis had no choice. He could fight no more. The British had been defeated. The tide had turned. 2 days later, on October 19th, 1781, General Cornwallis formally surrendered to George Washington. The scene was historic. The British soldiers marched out of their fortifications, laying down their arms in front of the victorious American and French forces. The war was not officially over, but everyone knew that this was the beginning of the end. For George Washington, the moment was overwhelming. He had led his men through years of struggle, through victories and defeats, through times when hope seemed lost, and now they had won. The dream of independence, the vision of a new nation, had become a reality. The news of the victory at Yorktown spread quickly. Across the 13 colonies, people celebrated. Bells rang out and fireworks lit up the night sky. The people of America knew that they had achieved something extraordinary. They had stood up to one of the most powerful empires in the world, and they had won. But for George Washington, the victory was bittersweet. He knew the cost of the war, the lives lost, the sacrifices made. He thought of the soldiers who had fought and died, of the families who had suffered, of the long, hard road that had brought them to this moment. He was proud, yes, but he was also humble, knowing that the victory belonged not just to him, but to all who had fought for the cause of freedom. In the months that followed, the peace negotiations began. The Treaty of Paris would eventually be signed in 1783, officially ending the war and recognizing the independence of the United States. But in many ways, the victory at Yorktown was the turning point, the moment when the future of America was secured. George Washington returned to his home at Mount Vernon, hoping to find some peace after the long years of war. But he knew that his work was not yet done. The new nation would need strong leadership to survive and thrive, and the people would once again look to him for guidance. Washington had become a hero, not just in America, but around the world. His name was spoken with admiration and respect, his leadership and character held up as a model for others to follow. He had led the colonies to victory, but more than that, he had shown what it meant to be a leader, to stand firm in the face of adversity, to inspire others with your example, and to never give up on what you believe in. The tide had turned, and with it, the course of history. The American Revolution had brought forth a new nation, a nation built on the principles of freedom, equality, and democracy. And at the heart of it all was George Washington, the man who had led them through it all, who had fought for their freedom, and who had become the father of a new country. The tide had turned, and with it, the course of history. The American Revolution had brought forth a new nation, a nation built on the principles of freedom, equality, and democracy. And at the heart of it all was George Washington, the man who had led them through it all, who had fought for their freedom, and who had become the father of a new country. Chapter 7. The Reluctant Leader. Chapter 7. The Reluctant Leader. The war was over at last. The long, exhausting struggle for independence had come to an end, and America had emerged victorious. The people were free, the nation was born, and the future lay ahead like an open road. For George Washington, the leader who had guided them through the darkest days, the time had come to lay down his sword and return to the life he had always dreamed of, a quiet life on his beloved farm at Mount Vernon. The war was over, at last. The long, exhausting struggle for independence had come to an end, and America had emerged victorious. The people were free, the nation was born, and the future lay ahead like an open road. For George Washington, the leader who had guided them through the darkest days, the time had come to lay down his sword and return to the life he had always dreamed of, a quiet life on his beloved farm at Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon was more than just a home for George Washington. It was a place of peace, of simplicity, of connection to the land. He had spent years building it, nurturing it, turning it into a thriving plantation. The fields, the gardens, the Potomac River that flowed nearby, they called to him. After years of war and turmoil, he longed to walk those fields, to work with his hands, to live a life far from the noise of battles and the pressures of politics. Mount Vernon was more than just a home for George Washington. It was a place of peace, of simplicity, of connection to the land. He had spent years building it, nurturing it, turning it into a thriving plantation. The fields, the gardens, the Potomac River that flowed nearby, they called to him. After years of war and turmoil, he longed to walk those fields, to work with his hands, to live a life far from the noise of battles and the pressures of politics. But as much as George Washington desired a peaceful retirement, the new nation had other plans. The United States was free, yes, but it was also fragile. The war had united the colonies, but now that the common enemy was gone, old differences began to resurface. The government set up under the Articles of Confederation was weak, too weak to hold the country together. There were fears that the nation, so hard won, might fall apart. But as much as George Washington desired a peaceful retirement, the new nation had other plans. The United States was free, yes, but it was also fragile. The war had united the colonies, but now that the common enemy was gone, old differences began to resurface. The government set up under the Articles of Confederation was weak, too weak to hold the country together. There were fears that the nation, so hard won, might fall apart. The people trusted George Washington. They had seen his leadership, his strength, his commitment to the cause of freedom. And now, in this time of uncertainty, they looked to him once more. They needed his wisdom, his steady hand, to guide them through the challenges of building a new government. The call came for Washington to lead again, not in battle, but in the creation of a nation that could stand the test of time. In 1787, Washington was called to preside over the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. It was a momentous task to create a new constitution that would provide the framework for a strong and lasting government. Delegates from all 13 states gathered, bringing with them different ideas, different interests, different visions for what the United States should become. The debates were intense, the stakes incredibly high. George Washington did not seek power. He never had. But he understood the responsibility that had been placed upon him. He knew that the success of the convention and of the nation itself depended on creating a government that was strong but fair, that balanced the powers of different branches, and that protected the rights of the people. His presence at the convention was a source of stability, a reminder to all of the greater purpose they were there to serve. Throughout the hot summer months, the delegates worked tirelessly. The room where they met was often stifling, the debates heated. Compromises had to be made, and there were moments when it seemed the convention might fail. But George Washington's quiet leadership helped to keep the delegates focused, to remind them of the larger goal, the creation of a constitution that could hold this new nation together. Finally, after months of hard work, the Constitution was completed. It was not perfect, but it was a document that could grow with the nation, that could adapt to future challenges. It established a system of government with checks and balances, with power shared between the states and the national government, and with a strong commitment to the rule of law. It was a remarkable achievement, and George Washington had played a key role in making it happen. But the work was not over. Once the Constitution was ratified by the states, the next step was to put it into action. The new government needed a leader, someone who could set the tone, establish the precedents, and guide the nation in its earliest days. The people turned once again to George Washington. They knew that he was the one man who could unite the country, who could lead with both strength and humility. Washington was reluctant. He had given so much already: his time, his energy, his very life. He wanted nothing more than to return to Mount Vernon, to enjoy the peace he had earned. But he also understood that his duty was not yet complete. The nation needed him. And so, once again, he answered the call. In 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States. It was a historic moment, the beginning of a new chapter in the story of America. As he took the oath of office, standing on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City, he knew that the path ahead would not be easy. The nation was still young, still finding its way, and there were many challenges to face. But George Washington was ready. He brought to the presidency the same qualities that had made him a great military leader: integrity, humility, and a deep sense of duty. He knew that his every action would set a precedent for future leaders, that the decisions he made would shape the office of the presidency for generations to come. And so, he approached his new role with care, with thoughtfulness, with a deep commitment to the principles of the Constitution. As president, Washington worked to build a strong and stable government. He surrounded himself with trusted advisors, including Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and John Adams. Together, they laid the foundations of the American political system, establishing policies and practices that would guide the nation in the years ahead. Washington understood the importance of unity, of bringing together people with different views to find common ground. But even as he led the new government, Washington never lost sight of his desire for a peaceful life. He longed for the day when he could return to Mount Vernon, to live quietly with his wife Martha, to enjoy the simple pleasures of farming and family. Yet he knew that his role as president was vital to the future of the country, that his leadership was needed to ensure that the new nation would survive and thrive. After serving 2 terms as president, George Washington finally stepped down. He could have stayed in power, but he chose instead to set an example of peaceful transition, of respect for the limits of authority. In his farewell address, he offered advice to the nation he had helped to create, advice that would resonate through the years. He urged the people to cherish their unity, to avoid the dangers of political parties and foreign entanglements, and to stay true to the principles of the Constitution. And then, at last, he returned to Mount Vernon, to the life he had always longed for. But even in his retirement, George Washington remained a symbol of the nation's ideals, a reminder of the sacrifices that had been made to build a new country. The reluctant leader had fulfilled his duty. He had guided America through its earliest days, had helped to build a government that would stand the test of time, and had set an example of leadership that would inspire generations to come. George Washington had given everything to his country, and in doing so, he had become the father of a nation. Chapter 8. The First Presidency. In the spring of 1789, George Washington stood before a crowd in New York City, ready to take on a role that no one had ever held before. The air was filled with anticipation, hope, and a sense of history being made. Washington, dressed in a simple brown suit, placed his hand on a Bible and took the oath of office. With those words, he became the first president of the United States. The nation was young, fragile, and full of dreams. The people had fought for their independence, and now they were looking to Washington to lead them in peace. But the task ahead was immense. The new government was like a delicate plant. It needed care, attention, and strong roots to grow. And George Washington knew that his every action would set a precedent, a standard for all who would follow. Washington's heart was heavy with the responsibility. He was not seeking power. He never had. But he understood that his role as the first president would shape the future of the country. He knew that whatever he did, whatever decisions he made, would be watched closely, not just by the American people, but by the whole world. From the very beginning, Washington worked tirelessly to unite the country. The 13 states, each with its own needs and interests, had come together to form a new nation, but there were still deep divisions. The North and the South, the large states and the small, all had different ideas about how the government should work. Washington knew that for the country to survive, these differences had to be managed carefully. One of Washington's first challenges was building a strong economy. The new nation was in debt from the Revolutionary War, and there was little money in the government's coffers. Washington turned to his trusted advisor, Alexander Hamilton, to help create a financial plan. Hamilton proposed the creation of a national bank, the assumption of state debts by the federal government, and new taxes to raise revenue. But these ideas were controversial. Not everyone agreed with them. The debates in Washington's cabinet were intense. On one side, Hamilton argued for a strong central government that could take decisive action to build the economy. On the other, Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State, feared that too much power in the hands of the federal government could threaten the rights of the states and the people. Washington listened carefully to both sides, weighing the arguments, considering the consequences. In the end, Washington supported Hamilton's plan. He believed that a strong economy was essential for the survival of the nation, but he also understood the need to balance federal power with the rights of the states. This was a delicate balance, one that would require constant attention. Washington's presidency was also marked by his efforts to create a government that truly served the people. He believed deeply in the principles of the Constitution, and he wanted to make sure that the government acted in the best interests of all citizens. He worked to establish a system of laws that would protect the rights of individuals while maintaining order and stability in the country. But it wasn't easy. There were many disagreements, and Washington had to navigate through them with care. The political landscape was still evolving, and different factions were beginning to emerge. Some supported Hamilton's vision of a strong central government, while others, like Jefferson, favored more power for the states. Washington was caught in the middle, trying to find a path that would keep the nation united. One of Washington's greatest concerns was foreign policy. The United States was a new nation, and it had to find its place in a world dominated by powerful empires like Britain and France. Washington believed that the best way to protect the young nation was to stay neutral in foreign conflicts. He wanted to avoid entangling alliances that could drag the country into wars it could not afford to fight. This policy of neutrality was not always popular. Many Americans, especially those who supported France, wanted to help the French in their own revolution. But Washington held firm. He knew that the United States needed time to grow stronger before it could take on the responsibilities of a global power. His decision to remain neutral was another precedent, one that would guide American foreign policy for years to come. Despite the challenges, there were also moments of great hope during Washington's presidency. The new government began to take shape, and the country started to grow. Washington saw the first steps toward a brighter future, a future where the ideals of liberty and justice could flourish. He knew that the journey would be long and difficult, but he believed in the strength and determination of the American people. As his first term came to an end, many urged Washington to stay on as president. They believed that his leadership was essential for the stability of the nation. But Washington was tired. He longed for the peace and quiet of his farm at Mount Vernon, far from the pressures of politics. Yet he also knew that the country was still fragile, still in need of guidance. And so he agreed to serve a second term, despite his deep desire to return home. During his second term, the political divisions in the country grew deeper. The debates between Hamilton and Jefferson became more heated, and the emergence of political parties threatened to divide the nation. Washington was deeply troubled by this. He feared that political parties would lead to conflict and weaken the country. In his farewell address, delivered at the end of his second term, he warned the nation of the dangers of partisanship and urged the people to stay united. Finally, in 1797, George Washington stepped down as president. He had served his country faithfully, guiding it through its earliest days, helping to build a foundation for the future. As he left the office, he hoped that the nation would continue to grow and prosper, that the principles of the Constitution would endure, and that the American people would remain united in their pursuit of liberty and justice. Washington returned to Mount Vernon, to the life he had always longed for. But even in retirement, his influence was felt. He had set the standard for all who would follow him, showing what it meant to lead with integrity, with humility, and with a deep commitment to the common good. The first presidency of George Washington was more than just a chapter in history. It was the beginning of a story that would continue to unfold for generations. His leadership helped to shape the United States, to set it on a path toward greatness. And as the nation grew, the lessons of Washington's presidency would remain a guiding light, a reminder of the values that had brought the country together and the leader who had helped to make it all possible. Chapter 9. The Farewell Address. In 1796, after 8 long years of leading the young United States as its first president, George Washington made a decision that would define his legacy. He decided it was time to step down. The nation was still in its infancy, fragile and full of potential, and Washington knew that the choices he made now would echo through the ages. He had served his country with all his heart, but now it was time to say goodbye. Washington's decision to step down was not easy. He had been a steady hand during a time of great uncertainty, guiding the nation through its first years with wisdom and strength. The people loved him. They trusted him. Many even wanted him to serve a third term. But Washington knew that the true strength of the new government would come from its ability to transition power peacefully, to show the world that this new republic could stand on its own, without the need for a single, lifelong leader. And so, he began to write what would become his farewell address, a letter to the American people, filled with advice, warnings, and hopes for the future. Washington wanted to leave behind more than just a government. He wanted to leave a legacy of principles that would guide the nation long after he was gone. As Washington wrote, his thoughts turned to the deep divisions that were beginning to take hold in the country. Political parties were forming, groups with different visions for the future of America. Washington feared that these parties would tear the nation apart, that they would lead to conflict and weaken the unity that had been so hard-won during the Revolutionary War. He warned against the dangers of partisanship, against the bitterness and rivalry that could arise when people put their party above their country. "Let me warn you in the most solemn manner," Washington wrote, "against the baneful effects of the spirit of party." He believed that if the nation was to survive, its people must put the good of the whole above their own interests, must work together, despite their differences, to build a stronger, more united America. But Washington's concerns went beyond just internal divisions. He also worried about the nation's place in the wider world. The United States was a new and fragile nation, surrounded by powerful empires that had their own interests. Washington knew that getting too involved in the affairs of other countries could lead to trouble, to wars that the young nation could not afford to fight. In his farewell address, he urged the American people to avoid entangling alliances with foreign powers. He believed that the best path forward was one of neutrality, of staying out of the conflicts that raged in Europe and elsewhere. "It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world," he advised. He knew that the future of the nation depended on its ability to stand on its own, to avoid being drawn into wars that could destroy everything they had worked so hard to build. Washington's farewell address was more than just a letter. It was a blueprint for the future. He spoke of the importance of education, of the need for the people to be informed and engaged in their government. He reminded them of the value of morality and religion as the foundations of a strong society. And above all, he urged them to stay united, to remember that they were stronger together than they could ever be apart. When the address was published, it was met with great admiration. The people read Washington's words with respect and gratitude, knowing that he had given them everything he had, his time, his energy, his very life. They understood that this was not just a farewell, it was a gift, a final offering from the man who had led them through the birth of their nation. With the farewell address complete, George Washington prepared to leave the public stage. He had done his duty. Now, at last, he could return to his beloved Mount Vernon, the place where he had always found peace, where he could live out his remaining years away from the demands of leadership. But even as he returned to his farm, Washington remained deeply connected to the country he had helped to create. He watched with care as the new government took shape, as the nation began to grow. And though he no longer held office, his influence was felt everywhere. His words, his example, continued to guide the leaders who followed him, reminding them of the values that had made America strong. At Mount Vernon, Washington hoped to enjoy the simple pleasures of life, to walk through his fields, to spend time with his family, to watch the sun set over the Potomac River. He had given so much to his country, and now he hoped to find the peace he had long sought. But even in retirement, Washington could not fully escape the call of duty. In 1798, when war with France seemed likely, he was asked once again to lead the army. Though he accepted the role, it was largely symbolic, a final gesture of service to the nation he loved. Fortunately, the conflict was resolved without bloodshed, and Washington was able to return to his quiet life. In December 1799, George Washington passed away at Mount Vernon. His death was mourned by a nation that had come to see him not just as a leader, but as the father of their country. His legacy, however, lived on. The principles he had laid out in his farewell address continued to guide the nation, serving as a reminder of the values that had built the United States. Washington's farewell address was more than just a goodbye. It was a testament to his love for his country. His words were wise, his vision clear. He had given everything he had to the cause of American independence, and now he left behind a nation that would continue to grow and prosper, guided by the principles he had helped to establish. As the years passed, Washington's farewell address remained a touchstone for leaders and citizens alike. It reminded them of the importance of unity, of the dangers of partisanship, and of the need to remain true to the values that had brought them together. It was a final gift from a man who had given so much, a man whose love for his country knew no bounds. And so, as George Washington returned to the quiet of Mount Vernon, he left behind a legacy that would endure for generations. His farewell address was not just the end of his presidency. It was the beginning of a new chapter in the story of America. A chapter that would be written by the people who followed in his footsteps, guided by the wisdom and the love that George Washington had given to his nation. Chapter 10. The Legacy Left Behind. On December 14, 1799, a deep silence fell over the nation. The news spread slowly at first, but soon it was on the lips of every American. George Washington, the man who had led them through war and peace, had passed away. He was more than just a leader. He was the father of his country. And now, he was gone. Washington's death was not just the loss of a great man. It was the end of an era. For nearly 2 decades, he had been the steady hand guiding the nation, first as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army and then as the first president of the United States. His presence had been a source of comfort and strength for the American people. Now they were faced with the question, what would the future hold without him? The nation mourned deeply. In cities and towns across the country, people gathered to remember him, to honor his life and his service. Church bells tolled and candles were lit in his memory. There were no grand speeches, no extravagant ceremonies, just a quiet, heartfelt grief that echoed from the hearts of the people who had looked up to him, who had followed his example, who had believed in the country he helped to build. But George Washington's legacy was not just in the victories he won or the decisions he made. It was in the example he set. His life was a testament to the values he held dear: integrity, humility, dedication, and a deep love for his country. He had shown, time and time again, that true leadership is not about power or glory. It is about service, about putting the needs of the nation before one's own. Washington's leadership was defined by his unwavering commitment to the principles of freedom and democracy. He believed that the power of the government should come from the people, that the leaders of a nation should be accountable to those they serve. This was a radical idea at the time, but it was one that Washington believed in with all his heart. He knew that the future of the United States depended on the strength of its democracy, on the ability of its people to govern themselves. One of the most remarkable aspects of Washington's legacy was his decision to step down after 2 terms as president. He could have stayed in power, could have continued to lead the nation for many more years, but Washington understood the importance of setting a precedent, of showing the world that the United States was not a monarchy, but a republic. His decision to voluntarily relinquish power was a powerful statement, one that would shape the future of the presidency and the nation itself. Washington's farewell address, delivered in 1796, was his final gift to the American people. In it, he shared his wisdom, his hopes, and his fears for the future of the country. He warned against the dangers of political parties, against foreign entanglements, and urged the people to stay united. His words were not just advice, they were a call to action, a reminder that the success of the nation depended on the choices of its leaders and its citizens. As the years passed, Washington's legacy only grew stronger. He became a symbol of the values that the United States was built on, a model for all who followed in his footsteps. His image appeared on coins, on the nation's currency, and in portraits that hung in homes and public buildings across the country. Schools, cities, and even the nation's capital were named in his honor, a testament to the enduring impact he had on the country he loved so dearly. But Washington's legacy was not just about the symbols and the statues. It was about the principles he stood for. His leadership style, marked by fairness, integrity, and a deep respect for the rule of law, became the standard by which all future presidents would be judged. He showed that true leadership is not about seeking power for its own sake, but about using that power to serve the greater good. Washington's dedication to the ideals of freedom and democracy inspired generations of Americans to strive for a better nation. His belief in the importance of education, in the need for an informed and engaged citizenry, helped to lay the foundation for a strong, vibrant democracy. He understood that the success of the United States depended not just on its leaders, but on the people themselves, on their ability to work together, to make decisions that would benefit the country as a whole. In the years following Washington's death, the nation he had helped to build continued to grow and evolve. There were challenges, conflicts, and changes, but through it all, the principles that Washington had championed remained a guiding light. His legacy was not just in the past, it was alive in the present, in the actions of the leaders who came after him, in the spirit of the American people. Today, more than 2 centuries after his death, George Washington's legacy is still felt. His life and his leadership continue to inspire people around the world. He showed that true greatness is not about wealth or power, but about character, about the willingness to stand up for what is right, to lead with integrity, and to serve with humility. As we look back on the life of George Washington, we see a man who was not just a leader, but a visionary. A man who believed in the power of democracy, in the strength of a united people, and in the importance of service. His legacy is a reminder of what is possible when we work together for the common good, when we put the needs of the nation before our own, when we lead with integrity and humility. George Washington may be gone, but his legacy lives on. It lives in the Constitution he helped to create, in the government he helped to shape, and in the hearts of the people who continue to be inspired by his example. He was, and always will be, the father of his country, a man whose leadership, whose integrity, and whose dedication to the principles of freedom and democracy set a standard for all who follow. Chapter 11. Remembering Washington. Today, George Washington's name is everywhere. It's on schools, cities, bridges, and even the capital of the United States itself, Washington, D.C. His face is on the dollar bill, on the quarter, a constant reminder of his contributions to the country he helped create. But Washington's legacy is more than just a name, more than just a face on money. His legacy is the spirit of independence, the belief in a government by the people, for the people. George Washington's story began long before he became a symbol, before he was celebrated as the father of his country. It began in a small farmhouse in Virginia on February 22, 1732. Born to Augustine and Mary Ball Washington, George was the eldest of 6 children. Life on the farm was simple but hard. The family was not wealthy, but they were respected in their community. From a young age, George was taught the values of hard work, honesty, and responsibility. Values that would shape the man he would become. As a boy, George was curious and eager to learn. He didn't have much formal schooling, but he was taught at home by his father and by tutors. He learned to read and write, and he studied math, history, and geography. He also developed a love for the outdoors, for the forests, rivers, and fields that surrounded his home. He spent hours exploring the land, learning about the world around him. These early experiences would stay with him throughout his life, shaping his understanding of the land and its importance to the people who lived on it. When George was just 11 years old, his father died suddenly. This tragedy forced him to grow up quickly, to take on responsibilities that many boys his age would never have to face. As the eldest son, he became the head of the household, helping his mother manage the farm and care for his younger siblings. It was a difficult time, but it also taught him the importance of duty, of putting others before himself. One of the most important influences on young George was his older half-brother, Lawrence Washington. Lawrence had served in the British Navy and was a man of the world, experienced, knowledgeable, and wise. He took George under his wing, mentoring him and teaching him about leadership, honor, and responsibility. Lawrence also introduced George to the military life, taking him on visits to the local militia and sharing stories of his own experiences. This exposure sparked a deep interest in George, an interest that would later lead him to a career in the military. As a teenager, George began working as a surveyor, a job that took him deep into the wilderness of Virginia. It was a tough and dangerous job, but George loved it. He loved the challenge of navigating through uncharted territory, of mapping out the land and discovering its secrets. He also learned valuable skills: how to survive in the wilderness, how to lead a team, and how to make decisions in difficult situations. These skills would serve him well in the years to come. In 1753, when George was just 21 years old, he was given a mission that would change the course of his life. The governor of Virginia asked him to deliver a message to the French, who were building forts in the Ohio Valley, a region claimed by both the British and the French. It was a dangerous mission, but George accepted it without hesitation. He traveled hundreds of miles through the wilderness, facing harsh weather, difficult terrain, and the constant threat of attack. The mission was ultimately unsuccessful. The French refused to leave, but it marked the beginning of George Washington's military career. Over the next few years, George Washington would face many challenges, in battle and in life. He would experience both victory and defeat, learning valuable lessons about leadership, courage, and perseverance. But through it all, he remained true to the values he had learned as a boy: the importance of hard work, honesty, and responsibility. These values would guide him throughout his life, helping him to become the leader that the new nation so desperately needed. When the American colonies decided to fight for their independence from Britain, George Washington was chosen to lead the Continental Army. It was a daunting task. The British were the most powerful military force in the world, and the American army was small, poorly trained, and poorly equipped. But Washington was determined. He led his men through some of the darkest moments of the war, always holding on to the belief that their cause was just, that they were fighting for something bigger than themselves. After 8 long years of war, the American colonies won their independence. But Washington's work was far from over. The new nation was fragile, divided, and in desperate need of strong leadership. Once again, the people turned to George Washington. He was elected as the first president of the United States, and he set to work building a government that would serve the people, that would protect their rights and freedoms. Washington's presidency was not easy. There were many challenges, many disagreements, but he always put the needs of the nation first. He believed deeply in the principles of democracy, and he worked tirelessly to ensure that the government remained accountable to the people. His leadership set a standard for all who would follow, a standard of integrity, humility, and dedication to the common good. Today, George Washington's legacy lives on in the United States and around the world. His life teaches us the importance of courage, of standing up for what is right, of leading with honor and humility. He showed us that true leadership is about service, about putting the needs of others before our own. As we remember George Washington, we remember not just the man, but the values he stood for. The spirit of independence, the belief in a government by the people, for the people. His legacy is a reminder of what is possible when we work together for the common good, when we strive to build a better future for all. George Washington may no longer be with us, but his spirit lives on in the hearts and minds of all who believe in the power of freedom, democracy, and justice. And so, as we see his name on schools, cities, and even our nation's capital, as we see his face on the dollar bill and the quarter, we are reminded of the man who helped to shape a nation, the man who believed in the power of the people, the man whose legacy continues to inspire us all. Chapter 12. The Everlasting Impact. George Washington's impact on the United States is immeasurable. He was more than just a leader. He was a symbol of the nation's ideals, a guiding light in the darkness of uncertainty. His life, his choices, and his leadership helped shape a country that would go on to become one of the most powerful nations in the world. But Washington's story is not just a story of the past. It is a story that continues to resonate today in every corner of America. Imagine standing at Mount Vernon, the place Washington called home. The rolling hills, the quiet river, the fields stretching out under the wide sky. All of it a testament to the man who loved the land, who believed in the promise of America. This was where Washington found peace, where he could step away from the weight of leadership, if only for a moment. But even in these quiet moments, his thoughts were never far from the nation he had helped to create. Washington's influence on the United States can be seen in every aspect of American life. From the structure of the government to the values that Americans hold dear, his legacy is woven into the fabric of the nation. He was a man who believed deeply in the principles of democracy, in the importance of justice, in the idea that a nation should be built on the rights and freedoms of its people. These beliefs guided him throughout his life, and they continue to guide the country today. One of Washington's greatest contributions was his understanding of leadership, not just as a position of power, but as a responsibility. He knew that true leadership was about service, about putting the needs of others before your own. This idea was at the heart of everything he did, from leading the Continental Army to victory in the Revolutionary War to setting the foundations of the American government as the first president. He showed that a leader must have integrity, must be honest and fair, must think not just of the present, but of the future. In the challenges we face today, we can still hear his words, still see his actions guiding us. When we talk about the importance of unity, of coming together to solve our problems, we are echoing Washington's belief in the strength of a united people. When we discuss the balance of power in government, we are drawing on the principles he helped to establish. When we strive for justice, for equality, for freedom, we are continuing the fight that Washington and his fellow patriots began. The story of George Washington is not just the story of a man, it is the story of a nation, a story of struggle, of victory, and of the ongoing fight for freedom and justice. It is a story that reminds us of where we came from, of the challenges we have overcome, and of the values that will carry us forward. Washington's impact is seen in the monuments that bear his name, in the institutions that uphold his ideals, and in the everyday actions of Americans who believe in the principles he fought for. His face may be on the dollar bill, but his legacy is found in the hearts of the people who continue to build the nation he helped to create. In every act of courage, in every decision to stand up for what is right, in every effort to make America a better place, George Washington's spirit lives on. As we look around us today, we see a country that has grown and changed in ways that Washington could never have imagined. The United States has faced wars, economic crises, social upheavals, and countless other challenges. But through it all, the nation has remained strong, a beacon of hope and freedom in the world. And at the heart of that strength is the legacy of George Washington. Washington's story is a reminder that the fight for freedom is never truly over, that each generation must work to protect the rights and liberties that have been won. It is a reminder that leadership is about more than power. It is about serving the people, about making decisions that will benefit not just the present, but the future. It is a reminder that the principles of democracy, justice, and equality are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The legacy of George Washington lives on in every American heart, in every act of courage and leadership, in every effort to build a better future. His story is the story of us all. It is a story that belongs to every person who believes in the power of freedom, in the importance of justice, in the dream of a better tomorrow. As we remember George Washington, we are not just remembering a man who lived over 2 centuries ago. We are remembering the ideals he stood for, the values he fought for, the nation he helped to build. His legacy is a living legacy, one that continues to inspire, to challenge, to guide. It is a legacy that reminds us of the power of leadership, of the importance of integrity, of the strength of a united people. And so, as we walk in the footsteps of George Washington, we carry his story with us. We carry his beliefs, his values, his vision for a nation that is strong, just, and free. We carry the knowledge that each of us has a role to play in building the future, in making the world a better place. George Washington's impact on the United States is immeasurable. He helped shape a nation that has grown and changed over the centuries, but one that still looks to his example. His story is not just a chapter in history. It is a part of who we are, a part of what we strive to be. And as we face the challenges of today and tomorrow, we can take comfort in knowing that his legacy lives on, guiding us, inspiring us, reminding us that the fight for freedom, justice, and democracy is a fight worth having. In every corner of America, in every heart that believes in the power of freedom, George Washington's legacy endures. His story is the story of a nation. His impact is everlasting. Chapter 12. The Everlasting Impact. George Washington's impact on the United States is immeasurable. It reaches far beyond his lifetime, beyond the battles he fought, beyond the decisions he made. He helped shape a nation, one that has grown and changed over the centuries, yet still looks to his example. His story is not just the story of one man. It is the story of a nation, a story of struggle, of victory, and of the ongoing fight for freedom and justice. Imagine the United States in its earliest days, a young nation, just beginning to find its way. The people had won their independence, but now they faced the daunting task of building a country from the ground up. The challenges were immense, but they had a leader who believed in them, who believed in the principles of democracy, and who believed that together they could create something extraordinary. That leader was George Washington. Washington's influence on the United States began long before he became its first president. It started with his role in the Revolutionary War, where he led the Continental Army through some of the darkest times. His leadership was not just about military strategy. It was about inspiring hope, about showing his soldiers that their cause was just, that their sacrifices would lead to something greater. He led by example, always putting the needs of his men and his country before his own. This sense of duty, of selflessness, became a cornerstone of his character and of his legacy. After the war, when the United States was still fragile and uncertain, Washington's leadership was needed more than ever. He was called to preside over the Constitutional Convention in 1787, where the framework of the nation's government was being created. His presence brought a sense of stability and trust to the process. The Constitution that emerged from that convention was a document that reflected Washington's values, balance, fairness, and a deep respect for the rule of law. It was a document that would guide the nation for centuries to come. But Washington's influence didn't end with the Constitution. As the first President of the United States, he set many of the precedents that would define the office for future leaders. He understood that his every action would be watched, that the choices he made would shape the future of the presidency and the nation. He approached the role with humility, knowing that the power he held was not for his own benefit, but for the good of the people. Washington's decision to step down after 2 terms as president was perhaps one of his greatest contributions to American democracy. He could have stayed in power, but he believed deeply in the importance of a peaceful transfer of power, in the idea that no one person should hold too much control for too long. This decision set a standard that would become a hallmark of the American political system, a commitment to democracy, to the principle that the government is of the people, by the people, and for the people. In the challenges we face today, we can still hear his words, still see his actions guiding us. Washington warned against the dangers of political parties, of allowing divisions to weaken the unity of the nation. He urged the country to avoid entangling alliances that could drag it into unnecessary conflicts. His advice, given more than 2 centuries ago, still resonates, still offers guidance as we navigate the complexities of the modern world. But Washington's legacy is not just in the words he spoke or the decisions he made. It is in the spirit of independence that he helped to foster, in the belief that a nation's strength comes from its people, from their courage, their integrity, and their willingness to stand up for what is right. This spirit lives on in every American heart, in every act of courage and leadership, in every effort to build a better future. Washington's story is the story of us all. It is a reminder that each generation has a role to play in the ongoing journey toward freedom and justice. It is a reminder that leadership is about service, about putting the needs of others before our own. It is a reminder that the principles on which this nation was founded, liberty, equality, democracy, are worth fighting for. As we look at the United States today, we see a country that has grown and changed in ways that Washington could never have imagined. The challenges we face are different, but the values that guide us remain the same. We still look to Washington's example, still draw strength from his legacy. In times of uncertainty, we remember his steady hand, his unwavering commitment to the nation, and his belief in the power of the people. The legacy of George Washington lives on, in every American heart, in every act of courage and leadership, in every effort to build a better future. His story is not just a chapter in history. It is a living legacy, one that continues to inspire, to challenge, and to guide us. It is a legacy that reminds us of what is possible when we work together, when we stand up for what is right, when we believe in the power of freedom and justice. As we remember George Washington, we are reminded of the values that have made the United States strong, the principles that have guided the nation through its greatest challenges. His legacy is a testament to the power of leadership, to the importance of integrity, to the strength of a united people. It is a legacy that lives on in the hearts of all who believe in the promise of America. George Washington's impact on the United States is immeasurable. He helped shape a nation that has grown and changed over the centuries, but one that still looks to his example. His story is not just the story of a man, it is the story of a nation. A story of struggle, of victory, and of the ongoing fight for freedom and justice. The legacy of George Washington lives on, in every American heart, in every act of courage and leadership, in every effort to build a better future. His story is the story of us all.